As she sat by an open window on a hot afternoon in June, Hester Ward argued with herself about the cloud of foreboding and depression that had encompassed her all day. She reminded herself of the many causes for happiness in the fortunate circumstances of her life. She was young, extremely good-looking and well off, and enjoyed excellent health. Above all, she had an adorable husband and 2 small, adorable children. She could not have wished for more in life, and appreciated, enjoyed, and wanted to share her blessings. She could find nothing tangible to warrant her anxiety, her ominous feeling of approaching disaster. Even the stiflingly hot weather in London over the last week could not be the cause, as she loved the heat. She finally admitted to herself that she had known since awaking this morning what had lain so heavy on her, and, despite a feeling of shame, called on her courage to look her leaden mood of fear in the face. She had had a dream the previous night, which, years ago, used to be familiar to her. Again and again as a child she had dreamt it. At that time, whenever she had the dream, it was followed the next night by another, which contained the source and core of the horror, and from which she would awake screaming and struggling in the grip of an overwhelming nightmare. For some 10 years now she had not experienced it, but last night she had had that warning dream which used to herald the visitation of the nightmare. The warning dream, which disclosed the vision she dreaded, was simple and harmless enough in itself. She would be walking on a high sandy cliff, some 20 yards from its edge, which sloped steeply down to the sea. She followed a path leading through fields, climbing over wooden stiles in the low hedges. Although sheep grazed there, she never saw another human being, and it was always dusk, and she had to hurry because someone, she knew not whom, was waiting for her. They had been waiting not for a few minutes only, but for many years. Presently the path led through slanting boughs of wind-blown trees, like walking through a tunnel. Beyond them stood the grey tower of a ruined church, amidst a long disused graveyard. Within the dream there was always subconscious knowledge of the man who had been waiting for her for so long, and now, last night, the dream had recurred, identical in every particular but one. It seemed to her that in the intervening 10 years the glimpse of the church had changed. The edge of the cliff, eaten away by the encroaching sea, was now up against the church tower, and all that remained of the derelict church was one broken arch. Hester knew that this dream had darkened the day for her, and now dreaded the nightmares that used to follow it, those that concerned the nameless one that waited for her. Happily, Hester's husband Richard returned home at that point and suggested that they eat out. Checking the mail, he saw notice of a private viewing of portraits at the Walton Gallery, to which they had been invited. He couldn't attend, as he had business meetings all the next day, but he'd heard there were some fine Van Dycks on show. The couple's dinner at a riverside restaurant cooled and soothed Hester, who that night fell asleep almost as soon as her light was out. Immediately she began to dream. She was now standing on the seashore, below the crumbling church, from which blocks of masonry and gravestones had fallen down the cliff. As before, she tried to run away, but the catalepsy of nightmare stalled her movement as she tried to look away from the sand cliffs in front of her, where she knew the horror would be manifested. It came. There formed before her a pale oval light, a man's face, dimly luminous above the level of her eyes, with reddish hair and sharp features. The grey eyes, set very close together, steadily and fixedly regarded her, but the cruel mouth was its crowning terror. One side trembled into a soft smile, the other sneering and lustful. The pale, lean face of a young man grew closer to her with a broadening smile and the words, "I shall soon come for you now." Again trying to run and scream, she felt the hot breath of that terrible mouth upon her, then with a tearing crash broke the spell of the dream and heard herself yelling, feeling with her fingers for the switch of her light. Richard rushed in from the dressing room and she begged him to keep him away. He told her that she had been in bed barely 10 minutes when she had started screaming. Hester explained that she had had an old dream, but that talking about it would only make it more real. The next day, Hester reasoned with herself that ill-omened face had no significance except for sparking her own fear. But with a sudden shrinking of her heart, she remembered that in earlier years those terrible lips had said, "I shall come for you when you are older," and last night they had uttered, "I shall soon come for you now." Also that in the warning dream the sea had encroached, while it had now demolished the body of the church. There was an awful consistency in these changes, in the otherwise identical visions, like a threat that the time was now near. Wanting to occupy herself, Hester took her children to the park, then set off for the private viewing at the Walton Gallery. After greeting friends, she strolled into a small room where 3 Van Dyck paintings hung. Still chatting with a friend, she glanced at one, a portrait of Sir Roger Wyburn. Her heart hammered in her throat, then stood still as some mental sickness of the soul overcame her. For there in front of her was he who would soon come for her. There was that mean face with the mouth smiling on one side and with a sneering menace on the other. She forced herself to look at this nightmare image, thinking that she should be reassured, as Roger Wyburn, to have been painted by Van Dyck, must have been dead near on 200 years. Had she seen this portrait as a child, leading to these nightly visions which continued to recur? Finally, Hester confided in her husband, who, awakened night after night by her screaming, sought the advice of her doctor. The doctor recommended a restful break without family on the East Coast. The following evening, Hester was installed in a small, near-empty hotel where she sat on the beach all day and enjoyed a peaceful sleep at night. Her memory of the face of Roger Wyburn faded, and there was no return of her nightly terrors. As Hester's physical health increased, she decided to stroll up the wooded slopes of a nearby hill. Despite a mass of dark cloud along the horizon, she soon stood at the top of a tableland, then followed a path into more open fields where a few sheep grazed and wooden stiles traversed hedges. Then, ahead, she saw trees growing slantingly, and beyond them a grey church tower. Realizing the awful familiarity of the scene, Hester's heart stood still. Then she gathered her courage. Here at last was the scene of that warning dream, and the opportunity to understand and dispel it. Under the strange twilight of the shrouded sky, she walked swiftly on through the fields of her dreams and up to the wood beyond which he was waiting for her. She entered that dark tunnel of wood and soon saw, close at hand, the church tower and monuments of a graveyard long disused. There was the eroded cliff and the remaining broken arch of the church, thick with ivy. She saw below the ruin of fallen masonry, the sands strewn with headstones and rubble, and at the edge of the cliff, graves already cracked and toppling. There was no one here, none waiting for her, and the churchyard, where she had so often sighted him, was as empty as the fields. A huge elation filled her, her courage rewarded, and the terrors of the past now meaningless phantoms. She turned to go, as now the storm threatened, when her eye fell on a tombstone that was balanced on the very edge of the cliff. She read on it that here lay the body of Roger Wyburn. Paralysing fear stopped her short as she stared in stricken amazement at the moss-grown letters. She almost expected to see that terrible face rise and hover over his resting place. She then hurried back the way she had come, and reaching the hotel, turned to check that none had followed her. The last train for London had left an hour before, but Hester longed for her husband's confident presence, particularly before the possible perils and dangers of the coming night. If he started out this evening, instead of tomorrow as planned, he could motor down in 4 hours and be with her by 10 or 11. She sent an urgent telegram saying, "Come at once, don't delay." Just as she returned to the hotel from the post office, the deluge of the approaching rain hit, with crashing thunder and lightning. Soon the street of the village was a torrent of sandy, turbulent water, and she pictured in the darkness the tombstone of Roger Wyburn, already tottering to its fall from the edge of the cliff. By 8 o'clock, the storm was subsided, and she was handed a telegram from Richard saying that he had already started driving and sent this off en route. By 10:30 he would be here. She sat by her window, counting the minutes to his arrival, as the rain ceased altogether. It had just struck 10 when there came a knock at her door, and the page boy entered with the message that a gentleman had come for her. Hester's heart leapt at the news, and she ran downstairs where the figure stood on the step outside. His face was turned away from her, no doubt addressing the porter, and in contrast to the white moonlight, the lamp above his head gave his hair a warm, reddish tinge. She ran across the hall to him, and as she laid a grateful hand on his shoulder, he turned. His arm was thrown around her, and she looked into a face with eyes close set and a mouth smiling on one side, sneering and lusting on the other. The nightmare was on her. She could neither run nor scream, and, supporting her dragging steps, he went forth with her into the night. Half an hour later, Richard arrived and was amazed to hear that a man had called for his wife, and that she had gone with him and was later seen walking hatless with him along the top of the beach, his arm linked in hers. The moonlight search found footprints which might have been hers, but without marks of any walking beside her. The footprints were followed until they came to an end, a mile away, in a great landslide of sand from the old churchyard on the cliff. It had brought down with it half the tower and a gravestone, with the body that had lain below. The gravestone was that of Roger Wyburn, and his body lay by it, completely unmarred by rot or decay, although 2 centuries had elapsed since it was interred. For a week the landslide debris was searched, but no further discovery was made.